This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the In Focus podcast. I am your host G. Sampath. India's public distribution system, its ration shops, through which subsidized food grains are distributed to the poor, is the largest such welfare program in the world. It is a lifeline that saves millions from hunger. But for some years now, the union government has been running pilot projects where fortified rice, that is, rice enhanced with iron and vitamins, is being distributed instead of natural food grains. The reason given by the government for this switch is that it will reduce anemia in the population. But a great number of the poor, especially the adivasi communities who have been getting this fortified rice, are rejecting it. They're calling it quote unquote plastic rice. Among those who have tried consuming it, many, especially people with sickle cell anemia, have been falling sick. The fortified rice is currently distributed in select districts in various states, and despite reports that there is no adequate quality control, the government plans to scale up fortified rice distribution universally from March 2024. So, is there scientific evidence that fortified rice is the best solution for anemia? Does India have the infrastructure to test the rice kernels before distribution? And what exactly is driving this mega push towards fortified food grains when there are local alternatives with higher iron content? We discuss all this in great detail in this episode of In Focus, and we have with us Anumeha Yadav, a journalist who has reported extensively on this subject. Anumeha, welcome to In Focus, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Sampath. Thank you so much for having me.
Anumeha, to start with, I was wondering, for the benefit of our listeners, if you can give us a quick overview of the entire fortified rice scenario right now. When did this initiative from the government start? What is the scale of the various pilot projects right now? And what does it mean when you say in your report that it is going to be universally scaled up by March 2024?
So, Sampath, I'll also just share a bit of a caveat that I'm a labor and social policy reporter. And how I came to this is that, I'm looking at within social policy, uh, what happens with nutrition, what sort of solutions are being offered for it, what makes sense, what doesn't. And what I'll be sharing with you is based on my research and, of course, interviews, some right to information applications, and so on. So, I'm no expert, of course, but this is based on whatever I read and learned through interviews. Prime Minister Modi had first mentioned food fortification policy in a radio program, in his radio program, in August 2019. But I think most Indian residents first heard about it when he announced it in his Independence Day speech in August 2021. And after that, it seems from then to now, it's rapidly scaled up, this program. And as you mentioned, that it's being done in the public distribution system. So perhaps as our readers, as the audience knows that under the National Food Security Act of 2013, the poorest two-thirds of the Indian population gets subsidized grains. This is about almost 600 million tons of food grains, of which, 600 lakh metric tons grains. Of this, 350 lakh is rice. And what the government has decided is that the rice that they are giving won't just be ordinary rice. For every 100 grains of ordinary rice, they will mix 1 grain of fortified rice grain. And what a fortified rice grain is that, say, a manufacturer takes broken rice or rice powder, and into that, in a factory, they are mixing a micronutrient powder containing iron and vitamin B12 and folic acid in this case, and then they are passing it through equipment, something similar to what is used to make pasta, and then they are making that into a paste and making that paste into a grain. So in that way, it's a bit of an artificial grain or a factory made grain, which they are saying that now this is enhanced with nutrition, and when people eat this will be better for their health and for fixing India's problems of anemia and malnutrition. So the government actually started it in about 2019 with pilots in 15 districts in 15 states. These pilots themselves didn't really scale up and didn't go very well. Maybe we can come to that later, what were some of the causes. So it started with these pilots. It started first giving it in children's schemes. India has a school lunch program, the midday meal scheme, now called PM Poshan. Um, the rice that being served to children, first it was given in those meals, then it started giving it in the ration system in the 112 poorest districts, then scaled it to 250 districts by that was about 2022. And last year onwards, it started scaling it up in the public distribution system in the ration, the rice people get at the ration shop. And it plans to cover all districts of India by March 2024 in each of these schemes, in the Anganwadi scheme, in school lunches program, the midday meal program, and the public distribution scheme. So that's where we are at right now. And I think in my report, when I last read the figures in October, it was about 17.7 lakh metric tons of fortified rice was being given out in these various welfare schemes.
Right. So, how many districts are not covered under this under the PDS with this fortified rice scheme as of today? Like, what percentage of people who get rice from the PDS are getting fortified rice, and what percentage is not covered?
So I think it's nearly almost covered now currently, Sampath. Whoever's getting rice now is in most states getting this. Perhaps like some small areas may be remaining. I wouldn't be able to tell you exact numbers, but it's nearly actually right now fully in ration. Whoever's getting rice is getting fortified rice.
Okay. Okay. So this March 2024 is basically we're extending it across all schemes instead of just the main PDS one.
Yeah. Yeah, that all three schemes will by then, that that was sort of a target they had set for themselves, but it is quite in wherever I have inquired, most people are already getting this. In some areas, it only started last year. Some areas it started in 2 years back. Now, since 2023, many districts are already getting this.
Okay, okay. So, Anume, I was going through your series of reports on this entire phenomenon, and I find that you have cited government officials who are claiming that there are many scientific studies which sort of give evidence that fortified rice reduces the risk of iron deficiency by 35%. Now, is that a valid claim, and what have you come across with regard to this, especially in your on ground report and fieldwork?
So, Sampath, one of the things I found which was peculiar, and I wasn't really expecting this when I went in, and there wasn't that much known about it, was that when you look at the government correspondence that's available on this, and there I should credit the Reporters Collective because they actually accessed some part of government correspondence which they published or made public on their website. And then I went through, this was about like almost 1500 pages of government correspondence. So they almost made it like a public resource. So I used my right to information applications and also used this correspondence. And if you go through this correspondence, you'll find that they rely on very particular set of evidences, which is primarily from a few entities. So there are some studies by Tata Trust, some studies by an American NGO called PATH, little bit by World Food Program, and the particular figure that you mentioned, I came across it in a food ministry letter where they were saying that as per the World Health Organization, rice fortification with vitamin and minerals, including iron, reduces risk of iron deficiency by 35%, which leads to estimated GDP gain of about 49,000 crore. So what they are trying to say is that this iron deficiency will reduce. Somewhere there is they are implying that anemia will reduce, and because anemia affects people's ability to work and be active, so many man days get affected by anemia, and then because that won't happen, then a GDP gain will result as well. When I started researching this figure, I found that what the WHO guideline that they are quoting actually says something else. It's in fact summarizing something which is a Cochrane system review. So I think it's a system of review of medical studies that a group of medical experts go through. Say there are 25 to 30 most current studies on an issue, and they try to summarize what the findings of that is. And in this particular case, in fact, it says a slightly different thing. It says that maybe this sort of fortification can probably, literally the word they use is probably, improves iron status by reducing risk of iron deficiency by 35% and may increase the average concentration of hemoglobin by a certain point. But, and now here I quote, may not make a difference to the risk of anemia in the general population of those aged over 2 years of age. So what it's saying is that when you start giving people as this supplemental iron, maybe it reduces the risk of iron deficiency by a little bit, but it may have no impact whatsoever on anemia. Whereas in a lot of the government documents, they're going on saying this is linked to the anemia crisis in India and the nutrition crisis. But the medical experts themselves seem fairly divided on whether it can really impact anemia or not. And I think one of the reasons for that is that anemia itself is not such a simple thing. It's not just iron deficiency which causes it. In fact, this comprehensive national nutrition survey of the Ministry of Health recently has shown that about less than half of all the anemia cases in India are because of iron deficiency. There are other issues like there are subclinical infections, there is inflammation. Those are also somewhat related to nutrition, poor nutrition, but it's not just iron deficiency which causes it. It's a fairly complex issue. And so then to think that if you simply add iron in someone's diet, does it necessarily get absorbed? Does it necessarily improve anemia? That may not happen. And like I mentioned, the sources of studies that they are relying on, they were I found it a bit tricky because those organizations whose studies they are citing, several of them who are funding these studies, then also it's a bit complex because they also have linked to, some of them directly have links to nutraceutical corporations. So it becomes a bit strange, why are you going only by a certain set of studies who are already advocating for this particular approach, rather than maybe keeping a more open mind to all kinds of studies by various experts who may differ with it or not. Literally, the studies they quote in the government documents is just one after the other. It's just like, we went and studied this, we found this improvement. But it's not necessarily, it's not that all of them are peer reviewed or really critical studies. And then there is other medical evidence, which is this Cochrane system review, where it's saying it's not clear what does it do to anemia.
Right. So there is clearly a question mark over whether fortified rice can reduce anemia in the population. Medical opinion is divided, and from what I gather is that the government officials have gone by cherry picking the studies that they would like to use for making this claim. But on the flip side, there also seems to be, based on your reportage and also other reports, that there are some kind of medical issues with a fortified rice being consumed. Certain kinds of people with certain medical conditions have been reporting adverse reactions. Can you talk a little bit about that, Anumeha?
So, Sampath, I'll clarify that, it's not so clear. It's not so clear that, because they ate that iron fortified rice is because it is why they had an adverse reaction or so on. It's more that public health officials are cautioning that what you're doing is that India already has an iron supplementation program in which capsules are made available to, especially to pregnant and lactating women and adolescent children, to consume iron supplement tablets. Now, on top of it, you're giving a little bit more iron in this rice. On top of it, there may be other sources in which they get it, maybe through some vegetable and so on. And iron is one of these elements which our body doesn't need too much of it. The other area I think where we all may be more familiar with fortification is in iodized salt. The thing, like how experts have explained this, is that when you consume iodized salt, even on that, actually, there's a fair bit of debate. What is good, what isn't, where is it appropriate and not. But salt is still consumed in a limited quantity. You can only have so much of salt in the day, or only so much of salt in your food. But there is a scope to sometimes over consume iron, and there are some particular individuals with particular conditions whose bodies will not be able to process this excess iron. In fact, they can even face something as serious as organ damage if it's given to such populations. So these include people such as those with thalassemia, in which this is again it's a inherited blood disorder in which your body doesn't make enough hemoglobin. So you may think, oh, giving iron to such a person may help them make hemoglobin, but that's not really what happens. Their body mechanism is such that it is not able to absorb this iron to make more hemoglobin.
So, weren't the people with the thalassemia and sickle cell anemia sort of excluded from some of the early studies, pilot studies of this fortification program?
Yeah, I think it's something like this, like, how most studies for medicines will simply exclude pregnant women and lactating women, for example, of experimenting on them, right? Similarly, here, because these individuals are sensitive and have a blood disorder, obviously they cannot be made part of such a study. So the effect of what exactly will be on these people is not known. Government itself has quoted a particular study by the Tata Group in Gadchiroli district, where in fact when I read the paper, it says we did not study these people. We excluded, say, 10% of the population in these two districts because we found they had sickle cell anemia. So even that study, which is propagating this approach, is avoiding giving it to those people because they understand there's a bit of a risk. And technically, so what I was explaining was more that technically doctors say that these groups, their bodies, it's not clear how this iron will impact them. So medical papers show that in some cases it can cause organ damage, in some cases it's not, it's simply unknown. So there is a need for caution in such a case, right? Instead, what's happened is that even though India has the second highest burden of sickle cell disease in the world, and almost 10 to 12,000 children are born every year with thalassemia B, so these are fairly significant numbers. But still, when you give it to a population like this, that everybody who's getting ration, everybody who's getting rice in the ration will now get this rice with which has this extra iron. You're giving it without really understanding that somebody with, say, sickles and anemia may end up having it, or thalassemia may end up having it, and nor do they really have this information. So what government has done is the ration bags have a warning says if you have thalassemia or sickle cell anemia, please don't eat it. That warning is in English, and anyway, when the ration is given out, it's given as loose grains. So it becomes a meaningless sort of warning. So it itself is admitting that these groups should not have it, but it's still being distributed openly as
Okay, let
open
us
grain.
assume that let's say an Adivasi farmer living in the jungles of Chhattisgarh or Jharkhand is able to understand English fluently and has read this warning and is aware that he or she is having thalassemia or sickle cell anemia and therefore does not want to consume these fortified rice. What options do they have? Do they have? Is there any other channel from where they can get normal grains from a PDS shop?
Yeah, no, good question, because there isn't any choice. Like if you're a poor person and you dependent on ration rice, and suddenly your ration rice is coming fortified with these particular micronutrients, in most cases people still don't fully understand what's being given. Some of them identified as distinct, but they don't fully understand what it is. And yeah, there is no choice, because if you depend on these food subsidies, you cannot really forego them. But I should add here that a few months back, Food Ministry has said that it will ask the Food Safety Authority of India, the food regulating body, to remove the warning. They're saying, no, no, actually, we think that the quantity that is being given in is so small that it may not cause real harm. But there are a lot of debates about these issues, and one would think that the least one has to do is do no harm. The principle of, if you're trying to do social good or social welfare, perhaps the minimal principle is do no harm. And here one doesn't see that kind of care of do no harm, because here some of these are the question is the results are unknown. You haven't really carefully studied it. It's not really possibly probably fully safe to even study it. And in some international settings where it's been studies, we mentioned thalassemia and sickle cell anemia, but people with tuberculosis, people with malaria, people who have very severe malnutrition, those individuals also find it difficult to remove this excess iron from their bodies. So basically, what doctors explain is that people with all these 4 5 kind of groups that we have discussed recently may find it difficult to get rid of the excess iron stores from their body. It can deposit in certain organs, and it can affect their health in an adverse fashion as well. So some of the WHO guidelines say, oh, if you're giving it in an area with, say, with high malaria levels, for example, you have to really like screen it, monitor it, be very careful. But as we know, like this is not how public health works in India. That in a lot of the areas which have a lot of malaria, in fact, there is very little, a very active, poor health infrastructure on the ground. So where will this kind of monitoring come from to really study the effects very carefully? And maybe there's definitely a need there to have given people an alternative and to have communicated more clearly about the risks.
Right, but the fact remains that there is no alternative for a poor person who may have sickle anemia to get rice which is not fortified. No, secondly, anemia, there is also the claim the government has made in terms of justifying this sudden push for fortified rice through the public distribution system to a population or set of communities that don't really have an alternative or a choice not to consume this kind of rice. And the justification given by them is, of course, to combat anemia, to combat malnutrition. And also, at the same time, as you have reported, there was no baseline evaluation of anemia before the pilot projects began. So, if you want to combat anemia in a population, you just need to first find out. It's common logic, right? You first find out how much anemia, what is the incidence of anemia in the population at first, and then you go on and monitor once you start your pilot project how it is getting affected. But without a baseline evaluation, how do we take this claim that it's about combating anemia? And also, I think there's not going to be any more data collection on these nutrition profiles of these populations anymore. Is that the case?
Yeah, when I asked this information from the Ministry of Food in a couple of right to information requests, and they did not mention. I asked, like, are you evaluating it? Do you know of other bodies who are evaluating it? And they haven't really responded with anything clear on that. This issue that there's been no baseline evaluation, it's been flagged not just by reporters such as me, but by the Niti Aayog, the government's own planning body, which studied this scheme in 7 districts in 2021. They went to 7 different states, and that's one of the things they pointed out, that if this is the aim, why hasn't there been a clear baseline evaluation? A baseline means that when you're studying something, you say this was the starting point, so that you're able to compare, say, a year later or 2 years later, that this is where after this was the difference after this intervention was done. So Niti Aayog's own study has pointed out that there hasn't been a clear baseline done, or there's no clear monitoring being done, which should be the least, like you pointed out, that that's the least you would want to do if you think you're doing this scientific sort of technical intervention. And yeah, one wonders why isn't that being done more carefully. If it's studying something more confidentially, actually even this Niti Aayog has remained, the report is not public. It's been made public, but that was more as a leak. It mentioned that it's a confidential report, and it's since it's a public issue, there is a need to debate this further. And even on a small scale, maybe one should in fact they should be communicating with people, what is this like. So does that justify using funds that way? Does it justify subjecting certain population to a risk in this fashion? Does it justify putting one's energy and yeah, public funds on such a intervention?
Right. And you spoke earlier about certain problems in the pilot projects, pilot studies. So, what has been the public's response to this fortified rice? What did you discover in your reportage? Did you come across actually anyone who said, "Oh, they're loving it. It's really great. We love this rice."
So one is that since you did mention the pilots, the former food secretary Sudhanshu Pandey is on record. He mentions that the pilots have not been successful. He mentions that that's because when he was trying to study it, he found that the infrastructure is missing, the laboratories to test these is missing. There's no uniformity of standards, so they were finding it difficult to even really try it out. Then, while doing the pilots, they did not study this baseline thing that we mentioned. They did not study the health impacts. The food ministry simply tried to roll out that when we try to do such an intervention, how will this go from the rice mill to the factory to the ration shop and so on? So they tried to test the logistics of the scheme, not really either the impact of it or the whether people want it or like it. The government's own documents again show. I think this is a finance ministry document which mentions that this is premature because the results of the pilot are not yet clear. They mentioned that the pilots, though they were supposed to be pilots in 15 states, 7 of them did not even take off. Many of the state governments were not really interested. I think they were not really convinced. Still, they went ahead with it. In my reports, what I tried to do was that, okay, sitting in a capital city or so on, you have the policymakers have one kind of idea. But if one goes and asks people, what do they really think of it? Is there acceptance of it? Do they like it? Do they think this is a good idea, that it's been made of? One could argue that this is so similar to what people are already eating that it will not require, say, taking a tablet for it. So someone who is in favor of this would argue that this is so similar to the food habit that maybe people will accept it more easily and it will help their nutrition profile. But what I found was something quite different. So I interviewed rice farmers in Odisha and Jharkhand, many of whom are ration card, they hold ration card in their states. because they are very poor, and many of them are rice farmers themselves. So like say I am from a wheat. My own food staple is actually wheat or roti. So it was still like, but I think for those who eat rice, they have their own relationship with that, or they have their own understanding of what rice should look like, what it should taste like, what is the quality of rice when you cook it. So they were telling me things like, if you cook it, the starch is not like what good rice should be. When we are boiling it, the some kernels, which are these fortified kernels, they simply rise to the surface, and they look like plastic. That's why many of them call it plastic rice. So simply, I mean, many of them saying that it just, for a food we've been eating since probably centuries or decades, this just doesn't match what our idea of a staple food is like. And then some of them even telling me things such as, oh, we tried to test it, we gave it to birds and we gave it to hens, even they don't like to eat it, how can we trust this? So there was simply a lack of understanding of why something which does not really fully look like rice as they understand it is being given to them. Some of them thought that it is plastic or it is artificial. Someone's telling me like, we think it's a Chinese export. I mean, there was all kinds of rumors about it, lack of trust in it. And there was a complete gap. Even actually, again, the Niti Aayog report also identifies it. There's a complete lack of communication of this information on why this is being done, or discussion about the people whom are being experimented upon. And it's not just, oh, there's a lack of public awareness and so on. I think the a better way would be like, you sit with them and you understand that if you want to make some changes in their diets to make it more nutritious, what should that consist of, rather than giving this top down solution. Here, take this fortified grain and eat it, and this will solve your problem. You asked whether some people were okay with it. So I found either people who were completely rejecting it, or there were some people who were like, yeah, initially we separated it, now some of us don't mind it, we let it go. But there was no great like interest in it, or there was more like, this is just bizarre or so on. And some of the local media, vernacular language media, have covered this. So I think some Odia channels, they have reported on how people are finding this, like they're thinking this is plastic rice and so on, and it's generated like, videos have gone viral explaining that is this plastic rice or something else. And like definitely there's no acceptance at all in the community which is supposed to be eating it.
Right. No acceptance, and neither among the communities and nor among the chickens and pigeons, which is tragic. But Anumya, you also mentioned while you were talking about the pilot studies that one major issue in unrolling this program and scaling it up was the lack of infrastructure for testing and quality control. So, what kind of infrastructure is needed? Where does India stand in terms of having this infrastructure? And if we are falling short in terms of testing and so on, then how have we been scaling it up?
Yeah, so this is something which has been, again, I found in the government documents that which are confidential, that several so Niti Aayog studies, one that I mentioned. Then there was a World Food Program study, which even though is promoting it, is acknowledging that the infrastructure is absent. The food secretary himself is saying that the infrastructure is absent. And there was also a study by the Jameel Poverty Action Lab. They, two of their professors won the Nobel Prize for Economics. They did a pilot study on it in Cuddalore in Tamil Nadu, and a lot of these studies find something similar. So there's something like this: they're finding that the technology to make this rice, is it still in its infancy in India? The kernel is being made in a way where it doesn't quite look like natural rice. So it's but natural that people don't accept it or they separate it out. The other issue is that you need to do something like this very scientifically. You're saying you will only add 28 milligram to 42 milligram per 100 gram. So you need very like proper laboratories, blending machines, and so on, to do this calibration very correctly to make sure this is exactly right. And what I was finding was the exact opposite of what you would want for such this perfectly running technical scheme. So the some of the people I was interviewing, the rice mill owners, they were telling me that they were suddenly told to make this switch. They were told like, oh, from say 2 months from now, you have to start supplying fortified rice into the public distribution system. So far, they were giving custom mill rice. So they were told overnight you have to get these blending machineries. Government told them, or you will not get the incentive payments we used to give you. which is like say 1 lakh rupees for every 5,000 quintals of rice they used to supply. So some of them in a rush tried to get some blending machines. Of course, like some are like, oh, because it was so overnight, we were literally trying to mix that fortified rice into the ration rice by hand. Some could only afford cheaper equipment for blending, which doesn't really assure good quality. And then there are issues such as there is no process to see the quality of the micronutrients that are being mixed, the quality checks on that. It can vary a lot. It can, you can get something for 250 rupees a kilo to 350 rupees a kilo. So when you're leaving it to a miller to purchase it, obviously they'll need to see what is economical for them. Then they purchase some low, slightly poorer quality kernel and mix that, and then those are rejected. Another thing is government's protocol says that these should be checked fairly regularly. So every batch of fortified kernel rice should be checked. Checking would mean you take some of these kernels, you send it to a laboratory which is accredited by the Commerce Ministry. India doesn't have a lot of such laboratories, and the ones that exist, they are concentrated in the south. Whereas, say, I was reporting from Jharkhand, Odisha, where a lot of the ration shops are located because some of the poorest people in the country live there. So they have a large proportion of the ration shops there, and those are the outlets where you need to go and check this rice very regularly. But the labs are located somewhere else. They may be in the south or they may be near Delhi and so on. So the time it takes to send a sample to the laboratory and for it to come back, that's pretty time consuming.
So does this mean that most of, I mean, you said that this entire project has been almost scaled up to the entire PDS. So that means is most of the grains which are being given, or are most of them not tested properly?
So I think so testing is happening, but a government is not being able to test as much as it itself promised to, or what it said in its own protocol for it. So, for example, it said that it must be tested from a ration shop with this frequency, from the schools at this frequency. But I found that that wasn't happening. Secondly, when they say that that it should match this level, the laboratory staff, the mill staff, some of the implementing agencies, even officials are telling me that the results don't match always what is the norm. They are saying sometimes we test it, it's below what the micronutrient level should be. If we test the same sample a second time, sometimes it's exceeded that level. So it's as if two laboratories are giving two different results for the same sample of rice. So all that really requires a lot of standardization. And I think for a vast and a very diverse country like ours, a lot of the mills are very small. A lot of the players in the public distribution system who supply these are not very large corporations. They are small mills at the village level or at the district level. They simply don't have the equipment and the infrastructure. So it's very haphazard. It's very uneven. Some areas perhaps it's going on fine. Some of these rural areas, it's definitely not going on fine. And government's own reports have flagged this, and international agencies' reports, which evaluated, have also flagged this concern. In fact, I don't know if you remember, we recently there was a large strike by rice millers in Punjab. Thousands of them said that they went on strike because they said government is rejecting the rice they are supplying because government is saying the micronutrient is not of the correct ratio, and they are saying this is not our fault. This, like, they are blaming somebody else down the chain. They are blaming the kernel manufacturer. The kernel manufacturer is saying no, it's someone else's fault. So it's not been streamlined, and it's definitely very haphazard even right now, even as it's been scaled it up.
Right. So the entire supply chain seems to have become very complicated from what it was for simple food grains. And what really also emerges clearly from your reportage is that there really was no demand for fortified rice from any quarter, and nor is there a market for it outside the PDS. And yet the government has taken it up in a very big way and given it a strong push. Despite also these additional challenges in terms of infrastructure, there are not enough blending machines for the rice mill owners. There are not enough laboratories to test these, and even if the laboratories are there to test, the micronutrient levels are coming at different ranges for the same sample in different labs. So a lot of streamlining, a lot of work to be done, and yet this work is going apace. It's scaling up. So, what exactly is driving this? I mean, you mentioned in your report that the Food Fortification Resource Center was established in November 2016, and I believe it was taxpayer funded to a large extent. So how did this come up, and why did this come up?
So Sampath, I'll first go a little, I'll trace this back a little bit from the larger issue which is at stake and which I could understand from the people I spoke with, those who have been following these issues for a long time, that there's a global pattern to all this. One is that, that after the Green Revolution, a lot of what's happened is that many parts of India which grew pulses, millets, it got replaced by rice and wheat, and diets have become very cereal heavy. Over time, soils have also become more depleted of nutrients. And then after that, there's a certain kind of common processing systems which have come, large scale processing systems which have come. So each of these aspects has actually systematically depleted our diets of nutrients. One, the diet's becoming cereal heavy. It simply gives you the calories, it doesn't provide you the nutrition. Secondly, a lot of the data recently is showing that the rice and wheat we are eating are not nutritious. The soils are so depleted. India's groundwater and soils are so depleted that the food we are growing and eating is literally no longer meeting the nutrition requirements or even matching the levels, the same food that it had 40 years back compared to now. And then then the processing, that you want to make white rice whiter and whiter, and you strip its bran layers, or you instead of doing small scale milling, now you're going into more large scale processing of it, which is reducing the nutrients. So the processing and growing systems have become such that cultivation systems have become such that you are depleting food of of its inherent nutrition. And this is linked to how we live and how we are making our production systems, our economic systems, and our way of life in a way. And if there's a larger issue which is causing these problems, you cannot simply come up with like one solution that, okay, we don't want to touch the other problems we are creating, which are more systematic, which are more larger scale, and they go back 40 to 50 years. And simply, like, you're almost like saying there's a problem, let's reduce it to chemistry. There is one deficiency of one micronutrient, we'll go and fulfill it by giving you a supplement. That's really no that's no solution, and that is very short sighted, and it's very it's really not very well thought out, I would say. So that's where I think that this thing that you mentioned, that this food fortification resource center came in. I think government is aware that this is a larger systematic problem, but it wants to be able to show some quick result, or it wants to be able to show that it's doing at least something about it. Or perhaps the data looks too embarrassing when you're a growing economy, you're one of the best performing economies of the world, but why are your anemia levels worsening in the population, or why are your nutrition levels of the population continuing to remain so poor? So I think it's gone in for this silver bullet kind of way, a technical fix in this thing. And so what he showed, what this investigation in the wire shows, is that um, one of the what I found was that a lot of the lobbying was being done by this particular hub that had been created within India's food regulatory body. It was called the FFRC, the Food Fortification Resource Center. When I spoke to the food regulatory officials, they said it was a partnership with Tata Trust. But actually, what I found was that, I mean, there was no clear, when I asked them for, was there a MOU? What were the terms of these agreements? There were no clear, they said no, it was an informal arrangement to work with them. The issue is that some of the entities that became part of this Food Fortification Resource Center, and this inauguration of this was attended by Bill Gates and people of this foundation, that they were advocating that this is one way to solve India's nutrition problem. But some of these entities have direct or indirect links to nutraceuticals. So, for example, the Piramal Corporation or the Tata Corporation, they own certain food businesses and also nutraceutical businesses. But another arm of the same organization, the philanthropy arm, is saying we will work on undernutrition. So activists especially point out that there is a potential conflict of interest here. You shouldn't just rope in entities who are also linked to other entities who also have a foot in the food business, or who can stand to profit from manufacturing certain supplements, or from or importing certain micronutrients. A lot of these vitamin making corporations are, it's a very concentrated business with a few
So,
international.
are you saying, Anumeha, that there is a conflict of interest here, where, for instance, a company which makes vitamins and nutrients is is possibly having a philanthropic arm which is partnering, or it's one of its affiliates is partnering with the government and saying we will solve the undernutrition or anemia problem by adding vitamins to rice. Is that so in which case the government or its partners would have to buy these nutrients, which would then be mixed with the rice, which is then given to the public through the PDS.
Yeah. So what I found was, and a lot of this was shown by, this, there's a group of researchers called ASHA. And then, of course, there's a Right to Food campaign, which is this grassroots campaign, which advocates for universalizing the public distribution system. They were also pointing out, and I found the same in my research as well, that it was as if government has taken this, there's a ready-made solution being offered by certain entities. Government is inviting them that, okay, come and become part of a food regulatory body, and they are saying we will give you the template. This is a guideline, this is the exact way you can make this is the technology you ought to use, and now go and implement it. There's evidence of this which I point out in my reports, that some of the language in fact even uses the same. It almost actually plagiarizes from, say, a document by path. They use a technology called ultra rise. The document mentions ultra rise, but later when it was pointed out,
Path is a non-profit set up by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
it's a product development organization, first started by Ford Foundation in the 1970s. And a lot of its funding currently comes from the Bill Gates Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So I'll actually, again, I'll zoom out a little bit, that I think that there's a certain, what I found in my research was that when one talks of these sustainable development goals or of development processes, etc., there's a certain way of thinking which is saying, let's achieve these development goals one way, which could be, say, let's go through public private partnerships, or let's go through a more corporate way of doing it. And there are others who may probably differ from that approach and say, let's make it more food based, local community based. And I think there's a certain attraction in this technical approach or this corporate approach where maybe, businesses feel there's a profit. They can reach poorer consumers whom they otherwise cannot reach. And government probably thinks like, okay, this is a neat kind of solution. It gives us something to demonstrate that we are at least working on the problem. And yeah, I think that it's far more complex than, I mean, it's maybe it seems like a simpler way than saying we will slowly work on the problem of malnutrition over the next 10 years through local food approaches, or ask the community what kind of foods you need. So what I found was in 2016, the food regulator, India's food regulator, set up this FFRC, a lobbying group within it's actually its own building. It consisted of Tata Trust, Nutrition International, a Canadian NGO, Path, which is an American NGO largely supported by Bill Gates Foundation, and the World Food Program. But it remained quite concentrated to just these 3-4 entities, and they even currently are the development partners in a way in various states. And one of the criticism is that some of these entities, in fact, all of these entities have received funds from the Gates Foundation to work on these issues. Some of them have direct or indirect links to corporations such as BASF, which manufactures some of these micronutrients. There are other corporations like Cargill or Matt McDonald, who have businesses in the sector of food or pharmaceuticals. And then these organizations then go and, government gives them a lot of power, gives them a seat at the table, instead of opening that to, say, all kinds of civil society actors or researchers, or making it more open and transparent. You keep it very limited to these entities who then go and implement it. And the government gives it, say, something like 3,000 crore per year budget. This may not seem very large, but if you compare it to, say, its budget for the millets program, which it advertises a lot, the budget for nutri-cereals over the last 5 years, it comes to about 1,000 crores or 1,100 crores. Whereas in 1 year, you're giving this 3,000 crores. So it starts to determine, like, it shows where your priorities are. Do you want to really go by the millets approach, in which you probably need to work harder at that, or give it more greater support, or better funds and better budget? Or do you want to go for this silver bullet sort of solution for which there is contested scientific evidence, for which you yourself are not evaluating very clearly or transparently, and where certain larger food corporations and processors stand to benefit rather than India's small mills or small farmers? So it's a bit of a contrast in these approaches, and there's an opportunity cost when you take an approach like this.
Right. I mean, a silver bullet approach is definitely the case here, and many would argue that it is not something of an accident. I mean, there is a structural logic to the state's preference for a silver bullet approach, because I mean, there is a well documented stream of critique of various philanthropic organizations, including the one which is involved here, the BMGF, where you have a technology, and the technology is used with government partnership to create a market. And here we do have a new market being created, which is for not just the companies which make these nutrients, but also for this product, this fortified rice kernels. I mean, I think you mentioned several Indian companies, small ones, which have cropped up over the last couple of years to supply these kernels for distribution. So a market is being created, including for multinationals which have links with philanthropic entities. Anyway, that's a different debate. Now, coming back to this entire distribution of fortified rice, Anumya, you talk about how international health organizations have insisted on an endpoint for a fortified food distribution project. But is there an endpoint for India's experimentation with fortified food? Is there any endpoint, or is it going to be like a permanent thing?
So I found in the government documents that the director of this Food Fortification Resource Center, which was a lobby group created within the government itself, was arguing that there should be no endpoint. There were some differing opinions within the government, including in Niti Aayog, saying no, it should be just one approach, or it should have an endpoint. And the United Nations own rapporteur on food has said that fortification may be a good approach only in countries which lack food diversity, which is not at all the case in India. And those experts have also said there should be a clear exit strategy, and you should ultimately, the aim should be to enable the community to feed itself more nutritionally. At the beginning of our discussion, you had mentioned how India's public distribution system also constitutes of a large market, and that's also what I got a sense of while working on this. That what's happening is that there are 800 million individuals in India who depend on this public distribution system. They become like a kind of a ready market sometimes for organizations to experiment upon, or even corporations to make a market out of. So of course, if there's a business or a corporation, nobody has a problem with that as such. But if you're getting into public systems, there has to be greater transparency. There has to be greater like you should be able to show what exactly were the evidence you went by, what is your response to contradictory claims, what is your evaluation showing. Those are the pieces we are finding missing in this. And in that, when you start giving this to a population which really depends on those food subsidies, which, as we mentioned at the beginning, they don't have a choice. They have to have this fortified rice and not custom mill. They cannot get that previous custom mill rice, even if they have a particular health condition, which government itself says, oh, then avoid. Those people should not eat it. Even they no longer have that choice. So what it's doing is, I think, when certain entities and corporations have an interest, say in a particular approach of food production and food systems being maintained, that let's not take a radical questioning of why are we using fertilizers a certain way or growing our food a certain way, what's really depleting nutrition from our food, can we make it more can we make it better in some other way, can you take the farmer's role in ecology of food production more seriously, can you address structural causes such as global trade and financial agreements which restrict a country from supporting local smallholder farmers, instead of taking on the larger issues of these food systems, you want to reduce this complex question of nutrition and dietary health to like a process that you'll simply add in vitamin, and in the meantime on the side maybe there's some profit to be made as well. So that's a problem in this approach, and that's where I think that people have said, that experts have said, including United Nations own experts such as its rapporteur on food, that if solutions that are trying to bring in these imported technologies such as fortification are being used, they should not create long-term dependencies for the communities, and they should include a clear exit strategy with the aim to empower communities to feed themselves. And I think that's especially the case that it's possible for a country like India, and government's own talk of millets, of the millets program shows that there is a lot of interest among local communities. Yeah, this was a contrast I found as well, that on one hand you had, like, say, in a state like Odisha, which government itself acknowledges as one of the best functioning missions to support millet cultivation and growing. Farmers had a lot of interest in growing mandia or millets. They were saying, yeah, this is our ancestors' crop. We used to eat it earlier. We can grow it without artificial, like we can grow it without fertilizer. We can grow it without irrigation. It's a short duration crop. Even when the monsoon fails, we can grow it. And there's a lot of research which shows millets are extremely rich in micronutrients. So instead of really putting its energy into that and into more agroecologically suitable farming practices, or even using the public distribution system to distribute more local foods, such as, like, say, more fresh food, fruits, vegetables, for those who eat it, boiled eggs, which has been one of the community's demand, or small fish. A lot of, like, there's a lot of dietary diversity that already exists in India. Instead of really putting its energy and funds into how to improve that, how to diversify that, how to keep food local and fresh in these public systems, you're trying to go down with this, like, one, like, top down solution where the evidence is not clear, where the quality remains very unstable. There is a big it actually puts pressure on small players such as small rice mills, and where even the community is not happy with it, or they are not seeing the sense and logic of it.
Right. Thank you so much, Anumeha. That's, I really appreciate your sort of laying it out with so much clarity here. There is definitely an alternative in terms of local grain varieties, food diversity, as you pointed out. The government did make a lot of noise about millets. During the G20, we heard so much about millets, and yet, as you pointed out, the amount of money which is being invested in millets is like a fraction of the amount which is going to this fortified rice program, which really begs the question why this is happening. And there, of course, there are like different possible answers. There is this tendency to look for a technical fix, which usually comes with the kind of dependencies you said communities should avoid. And the dependency usually comes with the territory, which is, of course, intellectual property related payments, which need to go to the companies which come with this technology. And once you have IP coming into the picture, there is a captive market for them as well. And there is something which has its own logic, which continues in perpetuity. At any rate, thank you so much once again for joining the InFocus podcast, sharing your observations and insights on this very important topic. A pleasure talking to you, Anime.
Thank you so much, Sampath. Thanks so much. So good talking to you.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.